Welcome to Stories of Transformation, a NRCDV radio podcast production. I am your host, Yvonne Ortiz. Today, as a part of our Domestic Violence Awareness Month activities, we start a new mini-series, Why I Am an Advocate. Each week in October, you will hear directly from individuals working against gender-based violence as they share their personal story on why they are advocates. For many of us, unlearning or resisting the social norms imposed of us since childhood is a lifelong process marked by a few pivotal moments that forever change our course. Messages that dictate these rules about our gender, our bodies, our sexuality, and what rights, boundaries, or limitations we can set around them are everywhere. While these norms may be culturally determined, they gain strength when amplified by doctrine within our social spheres and when embraced in our communities and families. The work of shifting these norms and the culture we grew up in is immense. It is the work of advocates. For our first episode, we bring you the story of Kendra, a mixed media artist, caregiver, feminist, survivor, and advocate from Richmond, Virginia. Kendra describes her work to unpack the norms she grew up with and promote the cultural values of safety and respect. She describes her own pivotal moments and how they give her fuel for impacting change.
Why am I an advocate? When boiled down to its most basic components, my answer to this question consists of two facts. One, because survivors need this movement. And two, because this movement needs survivors. I was taught as a child that the difference between boys and girls is that boys have a penis and girls don't. I was not taught the names for the parts of my own body. I started my period at 10 years old, not even knowing what a period was. I thought I was dying and spent an entire weekend changing and hiding my bloody underwear from my mother until I ran out and had to tell her because I had nothing left to change into. This led directly to a lack of understanding of my right to bodily autonomy. The first time I was asked by an ecclesiastical leader whether or not I masturbate, in the context of a worthiness interview, I was 12 years old. I was a child and did not even know what the definition of the word masturbation was. I had confirmed to me in that moment, in so many words, what I had been taught my entire life in subtler ways, that I did not have ownership of my own body. And not only that, but that my body and its functions were shameful. It started with my father saying to his chubby little girl, "You've had plenty. You're not still hungry. You don't need seconds." That taught me that I was not the one who knew myself best, that my hunger was invalid. It led to me developing an eating disorder at 9 years old that would continue for the next 15 years of my life. It was my father saying to me, after threatening to throw my toys away if I didn't clean them up, and in response to my naive and earnest, "But they're mine, you can't do that." "You belong to me," which means everything you think of as yours also belongs to me. That taught me that my rights as a human being and an individual were non-existent. I was raised in a fundamentalist and patriarchal Christian religion that was shrouded in a culture of shame. That shame was dressed up as concepts like modesty and virtue, where modesty means not being allowed to wear clothing where my shoulders or knees were exposed, so as not to tempt faithful men to have lustful thoughts. And virtue means that my value and worth as a human being can be altered by a man putting his penis in me. I was in Sunday school once where the teacher brought in a plate of freshly baked brownies. They smelled amazing, and she asked us, a room full of pubescent girls, who wanted one. After we had all raised our hands, she informed us that when she had prepared them that morning, she had mixed in 1/8 of a teaspoon of her dog's poop. The room was silent when she asked us, "Who wants one now?" This was presented as a metaphor for a woman who had engaged in premarital sex. When I was spotted once by an older woman I went to church with at the grocery store, wearing a tank top with 2-inch straps, she said to me, "Don't you have any self-respect?" As though self-respect is synonymous with shame. It was the middle of summer, and I was hot. Like many in our culture, I was not taught, let alone modeled, consent or healthy boundaries. It started as simple violations, like my mother insisting at 4 years old that I give my grandfather a hug and a kiss, even though I hadn't seen him in over a year, didn't really remember who he was, and hated that he delighted in tickling my neck with his scratchy beard. It led to a moment when, at 14 years old, the boy that I thought maybe I was in love with told me that if I loved him, I'd let him touch me. When that pivotal moment came, I had been shown no reason to believe that this was anything other than true. I came up with millions of other girls in a society that minimizes or ignores altogether the suffering of women. This society told my mother that the pain she was experiencing from her fibromyalgia was just psychological, just in her head, and that she needed to focus on other things like gratitude and service. Medical professionals advised her to try shifting her focus, adjusting her attitude. This mindset became so ingrained in the way my mother walked through the world that she endured months, if not years, of physical discomfort and pain before finally seeking medical help for what turned out to be, by then, stage 4 cancer. She died 3 months after being diagnosed. It was that much too late. I can't help but wonder now if someone had listened to her, anyone, in the decades before her death, if anyone had validated her pain as real, would she have felt like she could have reached out sooner? If she had ever once been allowed to feel that her pain was anything more than a fundamental moral failing, would she still be alive today? The trauma that I have experienced in my life has been extreme. One of the earliest memories available to me is of being molested as a small child. I was raped for the first time when I was 8 years old. I've been stalked as a teenager and as a young adult by grown men in positions of power. Emotionally manipulated, and physically and sexually abused by more men than I can actually remember. I was raped by a male therapist. I've been tortured, gang raped. I list these things now, some of them for the first time, because though my story is hard to hear and unique to me, the small moments, the seeds planted from birth over the course of my life that led me directly to these experiences of extreme trauma are not unique. I carry a list with me at all times. It doesn't have a title, so if anyone but me ever saw it, it would just look like a list of names. What it is, though, is a list of the names of every woman who, in the course of my life, has disclosed to me directly that they have experienced sexual violence. I am 29 years old, and this list has 49 names on it. I started keeping this list at 19 years old because up until then, I believed that I was alone. Alone in what I had experienced, and alone in the suffering that it had caused, and was still causing. I'm sitting here now sharing my story with you because I understand the toxicity of isolation. Every one of these women who has trusted me with their story has expressed that at one point or another they have felt just as alone as I have. I now believe that one of the biggest obstacles to healing is that isolation. The secrets that I was forced to keep were what made it possible for my trauma to last as long as it did. The first person who offered me the word rape as a way of describing what I had experienced was also a survivor. She spent nearly 9 months trying to convince me that the pain I was experiencing as a direct result of my trauma history was valid. Like many, many survivors, I didn't know how to believe that I hadn't deserved it, that I hadn't somehow brought it upon myself. This woman, to whom I will forever be grateful, in a sense, gave me permission to feel the grief I deserve to feel by sharing with me that she felt that same grief. Every time I share even a tiny piece of my truth with someone new, I'm aware that it's a gamble. From where I am now, that gamble isn't as risky as it once was, but there was a time in my life when being disbelieved or doubted was a devastating blow to my fragile, wounded soul. And it happened more times than I imagine many of us would care to acknowledge. I think most people would like to believe that they'd know how to react if someone they cared about shared with them that they had been through something awful. But how many of us have been fed a steady, lifelong diet of platitudes about choosing joy or focusing on the things we're grateful for? If these useless sentiments are all we have to cope with our own struggles, then they're also all we have to offer others. When the woman I mentioned earlier finally convinced me to reach out to someone, to seek help and to seek healing, I reached out to the leader of my local church congregation, as she had suggested. To be clear, this was a man who had come up in the same culture of shame that had formed me. When I confided in him that I felt responsible for causing my own abuse, he invited me to really think on that guilt I was feeling, to take responsibility for my part in what I had experienced. He read me a quote from a well-used church publication about forgiveness. It said, "It is better to die defending one's virtue than to live having lost it without a struggle." He told me that I needed to make things right by going to the police, and when I refused, out of fear, he accused me of making the whole thing up. He said he could not believe that anyone would have allowed themselves to endure the things I was describing to him and not want to go immediately to the police. The thing I will always remember him telling me is, if you've been lying about this, I would advise you to stop it now. Just stop it. This is not becoming of a young lady. I was devastated. I insisted that I was telling him the truth, and he relented and arranged for me to see a counselor who was, and to the best of my knowledge, still is associated with the church. He advised her to be thorough, to really dig into my story and make sure that I was telling the truth. In counseling, she asked me for specific and often triggering details, and when I told her that I wasn't sure or I couldn't remember exactly, she pushed. She looked for discrepancies in my accounts, which she then parroted back to me as proof that I was a pathological liar. I cannot even begin to describe to you the effect that this approach to therapy had on my healing. I started to question whether or not I could really trust my own memories, my own mind. I started to doubt my sanity. I considered that maybe I was just making it all up, or at the very least blowing things out of proportion. The misguided reactions I was met with from these two people who I trusted to help me set my healing back years. The shame I felt as a result of these reactions became so profound that it nearly killed me. In 2011, I was in the passenger seat of a car, being driven by a friend who I would describe as casual at most, when I experienced my first honest-to-God flashback. She witnessed this and tried to help me calm down as best she could. Even though I didn't exactly understand what was happening, she asked me some questions, which led her to the conclusion that I probably needed more help than she knew how to offer. What she did do for me, though, likely saved my life. First, she believed me. Then, she went on the internet and she found the closest place that offered free therapy for survivors of sexual assault. She made the call then and there and set up an appointment for me, and when the time came, she drove me to that appointment and made sure that I went in. She considers what she did for me to have been a very small act, and maybe it was. But small acts at pivotal moments have the potential to change the course of an entire life, for better or for worse. I started weekly therapy at the local sexual assault resource agency, and my healing journey began in earnest. I was led by the hand and taught concepts like what consent actually is and why it matters. I was given coping skills to help me deal with the depth and breadth of the emotions that I had suppressed for so long in order to survive. Today, approximately 6 years later, I'm in a different city than where my abuse took place and where my therapy started. I'm open and vocal about my identity as a feminist and as a lesbian. I've had my current job as a nanny for almost 3 years, helping to raise 2 children, a boy and a girl. Both of them are sensitive and encouraged to express their feelings. Both are praised for being assertive. They know the names of their own body parts. They both know that they need to ask before hugging and are both capable of and know that they're allowed to kindly say, "No, thank you, I don't want to be touched right now," to each other and to any other person, child or adult. Both of them know that the word no is important and that you always have to listen to it. In the instances where their no is not respected, they both know how to reach out to me or their parents to seek support in having their boundaries enforced. These kids know that their boundaries matter and that they matter. This is a part of my advocacy. If our society is unwilling to even acknowledge that there is a problem, we have no hope of solving it. So, I believe that the other part of my responsibility as a survivor is to speak, to tell my story in the hopes that the most vulnerable among us might hear it and start to understand that they are not alone. To make myself impossible to ignore, to shout from the rooftops or the radio stations that these things I've experienced did not happen in a vacuum. To tell our civic and ecclesiastical leaders, our teachers, those among us who are parents or who are raising children in any capacity, that refusing to listen to me and people like me, even when our stories are difficult and painful to swallow, refusing to believe that these things are not only being allowed to happen in our society, but are actually being cultivated by it, is to perpetuate the type of isolation that will allow these injustices to continue. I'm unwilling to stay silent any longer, and that's why I'm an advocate.
Thank you for listening to our show this week and to our storyteller, Kendra. Tune in to the next episode of Why I'm an Advocate as we bring you stories about the challenging work of advocacy and survivors' realities. To hear more NRCDV podcasts and to access additional resources on gender-based violence and related topics, visit www.nrcdv.org. Stories of Transformation is a NRCDV radio podcast production Brought to you by the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. Support is provided by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Family and Youth Services Bureau.